Is the department, well, the DTI, doing for micro businesses? All grants are given to already thriving companies, and we are left in the cold. How are we expected to grow? So there's your one question. What is the DTI doing for micro businesses? All right, first up, the second question just came through here now, actually. It's from Anele Ngese saying, how is the DTI improving local supply of goods to companies rather than companies importing the goods? All right, so that's a question there. Improving local supply of goods to companies rather than companies having to export the goods. And then there was another question a little bit further down. All right, okay, here is this question about Cipro. Just asking, is everything under control at Cipro now? There's still some companies that are really struggling to further their businesses and even get their businesses going because of the shambles that's happening at Cipro. Has that been sorted out? All right, those are the three questions I've got for you now. I've still got some more for you if you'd like a bit later on in the program, but that's it for now, and I hope you did get those, Peter.
Okay, great, Leanne. We'll come back to you certainly, because I think it's important that we involve our viewers as much as we can. But Minister, three important questions. I mean, the first one, micro businesses, what can be done? They're feeling left out.
Well, I did say earlier that the program for micro enterprises called SAMAF has now been consolidated into the new agency, Small Enterprise Financial Agency, SEFA. Which is under economic development. So there is a program, there are support measures for micro enterprises. I think in particular the ones that have been successful in this country have been ones which have tried to build on the sort of lessons of the Grameen Bank, where people act together, where people get micro loans and then pay them back together. Particularly women are involved. You've got a very high level of repayment in these activities, and I do think that has a lot of positive lessons for us in South Africa. We think a lot of micro enterprises might actually usefully form themselves into cooperatives, and so we're seeking to strengthen the cooperative support mechanisms through the bill which is currently going through Parliament. So I think that all of that does indicate that we do see opportunities there. I think micro businesses would benefit from the general measures which we're talking about as well, from the greater ease of registration of companies, also from the work we're doing on the from the 30-day payment rules if they have contracts with government. And I do now have some of the details on that we do have a hotline, as I said earlier. If there are small businesses out there that feel that they have not been paid in 30 days by any government agency, they can phone 086 0766 3729. That hotline has already facilitated more than 400 million rand of settlements to small businesses from government entities. 086 0766 3729. I think that's something that would happen there.
All right, okay, we're going to put that number up on the screen again, so perhaps if you could just say it once more, because I don't think we can ever say it too often. So there's that hotline number again. We're going to put it up on the screen now.
086 0766 3729.
All right.
Okay. I hope you've got
Fantastic.
that.
Yeah.
On the question of local supplier rather than imports, we within the framework of government procurement, and particularly government procurement around the infrastructure development program, we have introduced what we call designations. These are under the changed rules to the Preferential Procurement Framework Act. We have introduced designations for example, buses, electricity transmission lines, fairly recently for oral solid doses in the health sector. And these indicate that within percentage frameworks and particular rules product by product, all entities of state will be required to procure from local South African operations. We've gone a bit further than that in the framework of the New Growth Path Social Dialogue. We have an accord on localization, in which social partners, business, labor, and government committed themselves to an aspirational target of 75% local content in their procurement operations. Business has undertaken to improve its localization, and government and Labour has undertaken in terms of the paraphernalia which it purchases as well for events like T-shirts and caps and things of that sort, as well as furniture, office furniture and things of that sort, to procure from local sources. So we are trying to encourage proudly South African purchases across the board, including in procurement. Finally, on the issue of CIPRO, CIPRO no longer exists. It is now being replaced by something called the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission. If you want, CIPCO has replaced CIPRO. That is as a result of the passage of the New Companies Act. CIPCO did inherit a number of challenges from problems, I think, of mismanagement in previous CIPRO. And a number of challenges in terms of backlogs of registration and so on. I think they've been energetically applying themselves, and they have overcome a number of these. Some of these challenges are fairly deep-seated, and they are not yet at the level of performance that we are seeking. But I do think that the performance of CIPCO is significantly improved on what it was. I don't think we have the level of crisis that we previously had in CIPRO. I think that the leadership of CIPCO has in fact achieved a good deal in terms of turning that institution around, and that's the mandate which is coming from us.
Minister, just to bring something else into the equation here, you talked earlier on about the role of emerging economies in the global context and how much we're contributing, but I'm always puzzled at the influence that we have in terms of the trade rules. I'm talking about WTO. If we've got so much influence in terms of activity, how come we don't have the same commensurate influence with the trade rules? What can we do about it?
Well, I do think that in terms of the global debates, one of the realities is that emerging economies, but also developing countries in particular, have been able to assert themselves to a much greater extent than they did in the past in issues of multilateral governance. And that's reflected in the emergence of the G20, for example, but also in the emergence of a whole group, a series of coalitions and organizations within the WTO which have to be listened to in the WTO. And I think some of the impasse in the Doha round is because the balance of forces has changed in such a way that developing countries and their demands can no longer be ignored, but not sufficiently yet for that to imprint itself as the overall direction of forward movement in the WTO. We continue to insist that the mandate that was agreed to in Doha, which said that, quote, the needs and interests of developing countries should be at the heart of the work program, that manifesto, that injunction needs to guide the work of the WTO. We insist that the issues of agricultural trade and the issues of distortion in agricultural trade, because developed countries are not competitive in these areas and they have sensitivities, these have to be at the heart of the work program. It cannot be replaced by other so-called 21st century issues which a number of developed countries want to prioritize. There cannot be a disjuncture between addressing those concerns of developing countries. But we do think that the voice of emerging economies has been enhanced. In particular, I think the BRICS grouping, we were working with, even before we entered BRICS, we were working with other countries in some of these coalitions and organizations, but we have now increased that every time we do meet as BRICS countries ahead of those meetings, and we do consolidate our positions as BRICS countries, and I think that is giving us an additional leverage in all these international engagements.
All right, so that's great at the BRICS level, and I often wonder sometimes, Africa as a continent, we're probably sometimes architects of our own challenges. We've got our rand tracking the euro a lot because of the amount of trade that goes to Europe, when perhaps it should be tracking African currencies. Intra-African trade is abysmally poor, and I think we put so many barriers in front of ourselves. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the world. How can we fix that? You talked about free trade. If you're a European and in England, wherever, you can go to Greece tomorrow, set up a business and work there, live there. Will we see that in let's start even with SADC.
Well, I think that what is it that is stopping us from increasing intra-regional trade? Intra-regional trade in the African continent as a whole is about 11% of total trade. And I think that it's only to a limited extent to do with tariff issues. In fact, in SADC, we've already removed tariffs on substantially all trade. We launched the FTA in 2008, and ahead of that in 2005, South Africa and SACU, we removed tariffs on something like 98% of products in the rest of the country, the rest of the other countries. Have we seen a substantial change in the imbalance? Not really. What are the reasons for this? Not tariffs. They've got to do with supplier capacity issues. Other countries are not able to produce the products to a sufficient extent that are competitive on the South African market. If they can, the infrastructure doesn't support it, the products getting here on time. For example, in Uganda, when I went there with the president, we found that it's a very fertile country, it's got a lot of agricultural potential. If they want to sell fresh produce on the South African market, they've got to send it to Mombasa, it's got to come down here through ships in a clogged port and so on and so forth. I think these are the issues. Most of us are primary product producers. And a producer and exporter of copper doesn't have a huge amount to sell to a producer and exporter of platinum and vice versa. That's the problem. So that's why I think that we have been saying that we need to have a development integration approach. That's what we need to address. We do have barriers. We have a lot of trade facilitation issues, not in the area of tariffs so much. If transport vehicles cross borders, they have transport permits and all sorts of issues like that. We've got to address a number of those trade facilitation issues. But I do think that the African continent is beginning to identify a way through this, and many countries are seeing the importance of regional integration. Our currency tracking the rand, as you say, tracking the euro, as you say, that is a feature of our existing trade relations. Our trade with the European Union as a whole remains our largest proportion of trade, although as individual countries, China has since 2008 been our largest trading partner, and the growth is with other dynamic economies. But I think that it is an unfortunate fact of life that whatever happens in South Africa, for good or ill, doesn't affect the value of our currency, but whatever happens in the Eurozone, whether there's optimism or pessimism about the resolution of the currency of the Euro crisis, does affect the value of our currency. That is a vulnerability that I think that we need to be addressing.
All right, so let's go to table number 16. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Minister. My name is Vuyo Mahlati. I am an entrepreneur and a board member of Trade and Investment, KwaZulu-Natal. My question relates to the last discussion. I'd like to just understand, within the context of consolidation in the regional trade, where are we as far as SADC and Economic Partnership Agreement? What's the status? And also, Minister, the development approach, how does it contribute to us having a more focused approach to cross-border trade as far as informal trade and SMMEs?
I did say that I thought that the primary focus at this point in time is the consolidation of free trade areas across the existing regional communities. And that for us, therefore, I think the priority activity is the SADC COMESA East African Community process, which the AU now wants to consolidate into a comprehensive continental free trade area process. And I think there's some very good reasons for that, as I tried to indicate right at the outset. And that is that the large emerging economies all have sizable domestic markets which are driving their growth. I mean, China has a population of 1.3 billion people, India 1.1 billion, and so on and so forth. We add only to the 1/3 of the world's population, which BRICS represents. We add a very small pimple with our 50 million. So we don't have the base as individual countries, but as big regions we do. So I think that broadening integration at the FTA level is actually a priority at this point in time for us. Now, the economic partnership agreements with the European Union, these have been hugely controversial matters, not just among ourselves, but within the African continent, where the EU sought to change the preferences which it offered to African countries into a comprehensive free trade agreement, but not only a free trade agreement, but consolidate that with a whole series of demands around trade-related obligations of one sort or another. I think what we have seen, we've seen that the European Union is becoming a bit more flexible, and we are engaged in negotiations with them as part of the SADC-EPA group. We would like to seek an outcome to that which does give us the policy space we need, but which does consolidate as far as possible a common position within SADC and between members of the Southern African Customs Union in particular. What is the development integration approach? Essentially what I think we're saying is we're saying that all the problems of promoting intra-regional trade will not be solved by the construction of formal arrangements in their own right. I think we can see that in Europe, the formal arrangements which are in advance of real integration, in this case a monetary union encompassing fairly divergent economies without fiscal policy consolidation and so on, has caused enormous problems in Europe. And so I think we want to say that formal arrangements should not outpace what actually exists on the ground. So cooperation to promote diversification and in particular infrastructure development. The infrastructure we have on the African continent is largely infrastructure which supports primary products being produced in the mine and taken to the port and then taken outside of the continent as a whole. It does not support connections between ourselves. We have inadequate connections between ourselves. And so, for example, the SADC COMESA East African Community process is accompanied by an infrastructure program called the North-South Corridor, which our president is the champion of within the AU framework. And that's 85 projects, road, rail connections between Central Africa and ourselves eventually. And it is, I think, a very important part of building a new road, rail infrastructure which can support a growing level of interaction between ourselves. That's to build. That's what we lack on the African continent. And our advances, I think, in this area, as well as in building economic diversification, are going to be the basis on which we have to consider further steps in integration, like movements to customs unions and so on and so forth. Not the other way around, that we have some formal arrangement that prioritizes itself over what actually emerges and is developing on the ground. We need to be guided by what is emerging and developing on the ground.
All right, okay, let's go straight to table number 8. All right, so if you could just stand up and say your name.
Rory McNamara from Interact Media. Thank you, Minister, for being as freely available as you are, unlike some of your colleagues. My question is going to relate around compliance and compulsory standards which fall into your department under the Bureau of Standards and the national regulator. It is a fact that non-compliant imports are killing the local manufacturing industry. So my question is, how and when is the DTI going to act on this issue of non-compliant imports? Thank you.
Well, I think that let me just start off by saying that in the National Industrial Policy Framework and the Industrial Policy Action Plans that we have launched under this administration, we have sought to elevate the role of standards. And I think that we have seen, in fact, as tariffs become less important as international trade issues, standards and things of that sort are becoming much more significant. And I think we have seen with the emergence of the National Regulator of Compulsory Specifications, just to clarify, the National Regulator sets compulsory standards for a whole range of goods which have to be sold on the South African market. We would want to seek to expand and strengthen the role of the National Regulator in terms of enforcement. The National Regulator is setting standards. It says that the electricity wires, the lights, the crash helmets, the paraffin stoves all have to meet minimum standards. The question and the challenge, I think, is around enforcement. And I think what we are seeking in enforcement is to build a series of partnerships with the private sector as well. We're trying to be as smart as we can around this, because I think that routine surveillance at ports and so on is not going to be the answer. We need much more intelligence-driven processes. And I've been saying to the private sector, you are the ones who know where the substandard goods, which don't meet the national regulations, where they are being sold. Give us that intelligence and then we can act on it. And as far as possible, I think we'll try to do that. We would also like to build links into the Consumer Protection Act, the National Consumer Protection Act, because I can see that there are some important ways in which that act can reinforce the work of the national regulator. Let me give an example of substandard paraffin heaters. Those are the sort of things that are sold to people in squatter camps. People are offered these things, the substandard ones, the ones that fall over and cause fires. They offered them at lower prices. Now, if we go around to people and say to them, don't buy the cheaper one, we're not going to get much of a hearing. But if they fall over and they cause a fire, the supplier, the wholesaler, the importer, all of them under the Consumer Protection Act are liable. And I think we need to build those cautions into the way we act. So it's not just that that somebody has been responsible for substandard, but somebody in the supply chain who supplied those is also liable under the Consumer Protection Act. So I think that we certainly want to strengthen our enforcement, but I think that the only way we can do it is by way of smart action and with partnerships, in particular with private sector players who know that they are being outcompeted by unsafe and unfair substandard products entering our market. We don't want to see that. As far as possible, I think we want to be more effective in this particular area.
All right, let's get straight to table number 21. I think this is an important one, especially with the state of youth unemployment. Table number 21.
Good morning, Minister. I'm Nompumelelo Haga, along with my colleague, Tiffany Brown. We're both interns at the New Age. My question is, as the youth ourselves, how does the DTI plan investing in the future generation with the issue of going green, also getting that to grow for our economy? And then again, as much as we're turning into techno-heads, how can we get that to work for our advantage? Thank you.
Well, I think that the question of youth unemployment is something which we have accepted as government requires that there are youth-specific programs. So all of our programs have to have a particular youth focus. So I think that what we try to do in, for example, our enterprise development and so on, is to try to find a youth-specific dimension to that. I think we are trying to seek, in terms of support for training programs, that there is an expansion of training opportunities with a particular focus on young people and so on. I think the other part of your question, if I heard it correctly, was about green. And I think that we are trying to embrace the movement towards a green economy as an opportunity for industrial development. It's an obligation that we all have, because if we don't green our economic activities across the planet, we're going to face catastrophic climate change. But we need to also turn that into an economic opportunity. And I think, for example, what we have done in South Africa is we have taken a decision that 1/4 of our new energy requirements between now and 2030 will come from renewable sources. And that level of ambition is there because we think it will support industrial activities. It'll provide the scale for industrial activities. And we've been saying that the next wave of industrialization is often suggested as being the green economy. The last wave of industrial development was the ICT revolution. And Africa and South Africa largely related to the ICT revolution as service providers of somebody else's manufactured goods. This time around, we need to be the manufacturers as well. And so we are putting in place programs which are seeking to ensure that a significant part of the windmills and of the solar generation facilities come from local manufacturing. But also, I think that we need to become very much aware that being green is part of the competitiveness of all industries across the board. And so we are supporting, for example, a standard ISO 50001, which is a standard which is around energy saving. And we want to try to encourage a lot more of this and provide incentives to companies to comply with these kind of standards. One of the plants, agro-industrial plants, which I had the privilege of opening during COP17 last year in Durban, a foreign investment plant in Durban. It was described to me as the most advanced agro-industrial plant in the stable of that particular multinational. And one element of it being an advanced plant is that it has a considerable amount of energy saving. It doesn't take any water off the municipal system, and it doesn't put anything into the municipal landfill. It is in fact environmentally sensitive, and I think that we need to encourage that as an element of competitiveness across the board.
All right, so we're going to start trying to wrap up things, but there's one issue that I think is of concern perhaps. The arms deal doesn't want to go away, but it does affect your ministry. There were some offsets that were supposed to happen where these companies that in return for purchasing strategic assets from them, they were going to invest in various parts of the economy. For example, people like BAE Saab were supposed to invest something to the tune of 54 billion rand, and they've only invested 1.5 so far. And that's just a sign of non-compliance. What are we doing about that? Because we're certainly not getting our promises fulfilled, and yet they've benefited greatly.
Well, I think that the first thing is that what often happened in the presentation of the obligations was that apples and potatoes were added together, and something called benefits was the outcome. So quite often those obligations were stated in terms of investment plus sales and exports. And I think that when you unpack those and you see the milestones, mostly the milestones have been achieved by the arms deal obligors. I think there's one or two where that hasn't happened. But what we have tried to do in terms of the National Industrial Participation Program, we've tried to learn a few lessons from that. First of all, one of the issues that cropped up there was that there was something called multipliers, where people were able to earn multipliers off their obligations and therefore reduce their obligations for various things. I think we will certainly pay much more attention to that in future offset agreements, not necessarily related to arms. I should perhaps say that the National Industrial Participation Program says that if any entity in the government procures something from abroad worth more than $10 million US, they're supposed to negotiate some offset arrangement. So it applies to all sorts of things. It applies to purchases of aircraft, all sorts of things like that. The other thing we want to do is we want to try to tie the obligations much more to the sector where the purchase took place, so that we can use it as a tool of industrialization in the particular area concerned. We found that in the arms deal, obligations could be fulfilled in absolutely anything not related to the industry or area where the purchases took place. We want to bring that much more closely together. We also want to make sure that all ambiguities about application to the different spheres of government are done away with. It's part of our overall policy and program of trying to rejig our procurement regulations across the board so that we have a much tighter set of instruments to support local manufacturing.
All right, so lessons learned then. All right, unfortunately, as time is never on our side, just as conversations start to get a little bit more exciting, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, the Minister of Trade and Industry, Mr. Rob Davies.
Thank you very much.